name is Lauren Niegard. I'm an events coordinator here at ASUG, and I will be your moderator. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for this. Some notes before we get started. Experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A widget on your console at the bottom of your screen, or by clicking the Q&A button, and we will get to as many of those questions at the end as possible. Today's being recorded, and the link will be distributed in a follow-up email tomorrow, along with the slide deck from the presentation. And before you leave today, we'd appreciate if you could take a minute or two to fill out our webcast survey, and the speakers in ASUG would appreciate your feedback. And you can make sure to check out more relevant content with the links in the resource widget as well. So that's it from ASUG. Today's webcast is The Market Speaks, 3 Megatrends in SAP Operations Innovations. Our speakers today are John Appleby, CEO of Avantra, and Anne-Marie Gray, our VP of Content Strategy and Research from ASUG. I will hand it over to our speakers now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much for joining us. And Anne-Marie, thanks so much also for joining. We can get started. Maybe Anne-Marie, briefly, you could introduce yourself. Looks like Anne-Marie may be getting some technical issues, so I'm going to continue this while she gets that.
I'm back. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for the intro, Lauren. And also, I'm excited to be here with you, John, today to talk about some research that we did with Avantra on the state of IT operations and automation earlier this year. We have some great trends to share with everyone in the audience today.
Wonderful. So let's get started, and maybe we just take a step back to where we kind of began with all this. And I wanted, as an SAP operations software business, I'd wanted some research which sort of speaks to the voice of the customer and what they were thinking. And when we went looking for that, and we went and look in the usual places, the usual suspects, the Gartners and the Forresters, the IDCs and ASUGs and DSAGs, we found that nobody had actually done any research on the IT SAP operations market, which we thought was really fascinating. And so I then went to identify, what would be the best organization to do this research, so we could find insights about the market and how our software could help and what people were looking to do. And so that's how we got introduced to ASUG and Anne-Marie. And we then set about a project which started, it feels like 6 months ago now, to really to get into the customer mindset. And this is the results of that, and we felt that the results were interesting enough to do a webinar and a white paper to help customers understand where we believe this market is moving. So Anne-Marie, if you wanted to add a little bit on the context from your end.
Sure, absolutely. For those of you who've joined us today who may not know, ASUG does run a research function within the organization that really works to surface the voice of the SAP customers like you and understand these trends. We do kind of a mixture of research projects that are commissioned, like this one we did for Avantra, as well as some ASUG signature research projects, like the Pulse of the SAP customer project that we do annually that's going on right now. And really, it's all in the interest of understanding the behaviors, the trends, the needs of the SAP customer community, and sharing that with all of you, and also sharing it back with SAP so they understand what your needs are as well. So ASUG and DSAG are important advocates for the SAP customer, and we need the data to be able to go back to SAP and talk to them about what customers really need. So in this particular case, this was a commission study, as John mentioned, where when he came to us and he was talking about his idea for filling in this gap, I thought it would be a wonderful way to dive into more of what's going on within the IT operations space, particularly around managing SAP systems. We talked a lot about complexity of those systems, which we'll get into later with some data for you today. And I really agreed with him that it was kind of a blank space, and that ASUG is really the best place to come to because we really have such engaged members who are working in that IT ops space, who are responsible for managing those systems. And the best way to find out what's going on with them is to hear that from all of you. So the other thing we did know with respect to innovation, which is also a topic that will come up today, is that as SAP customers really struggle with that balance of how do they manage their day-to-day, keep the lights on systems, and how do they keep up with all the innovations that are coming at them at 100 miles an hour every day, all the digital transformation work, all the moves to S4, you name it, essentially. So we did get some really good data, but within the lens of how that affects IT operations teams specifically that we'll be getting into later today. So, John, back to you.
Yeah, and I fully support that. The thing that I thought, in retrospect is really odd is how much money is spent on SAP operations. It's this enormous market, and yet how little research there is on it, and that's. Just looking back on it, it's kind of really odd that this hasn't been done before. But let's get to the sort of meat of this. So, I'll let you speak to this, Anne-Marie. But I think we found that in this research that there was a real difference between the theory and practice when it comes to innovation and the desire to innovate versus the ability to innovate.
That's exactly right. And one of the questions that we asked in the survey was why and how innovation happens within SAP IT Ops in the first place. And the two top answers that we got from the audience this time is, number one, it was really to transform and grow. And we all understand how important technology is to organizations, and the IT Ops team is at the center of that. And they're being asked to, help the business grow through technology. So that is really the way that those IT Ops teams are thinking about innovation. And innovation is a big word. It can mean a lot of different things, but that's why we thought it was important to ask what it meant specifically to that group. The second most important mention was actually bringing in and implementing automation. So, understanding that there's a resource issue and there's cost issues always, which we'll get into some data on a little bit later, but that I think there's an understanding that in order to innovate, that automation has to come into play in some way, shape, or form. So those are some interesting findings that we thought this year. And we also learned that IT ops organizations are very willing to innovate. So, there may be a perception that IT departments are slow or they're stuck in their ways, but we really found that 74% of the respondents in this survey in particular said that they're either extremely or somewhat willing to adopt new technologies and move on to the next thing. So as John mentioned, the desire to innovate is clearly there, and we have the numbers to show that. It's just that there are some limitations that IT ops organizations are facing right now, particularly with respect to managing their SAP systems, that they have to somehow break through in order to get from that theory of wanting to innovate and the practice of actually being able to do it.
Yeah, and I'll add one more fascinating thing that I found, and this didn't come from the survey, but I was talking to an executive within a very large IT services company, and the legacy model has been, how many people can you sell? What's the billing rate? How many people can you sell at how many dollars an hour? And that's driven the whole operations industry for the last 30 years, since R3. And you have these functional teams and these technical teams, they call them CMS and AMS, and the whole model is based around and stacking up human lives, which is really odd. And that came to a head this year, and those that have read the media will have seen, all of a sudden people couldn't get in the office and they couldn't maintain the systems. And I think people then started to think, why are we continuing to have this extremely people-heavy model in an environment that just doesn't work for it? And I think that, bring that back to the sort of psychology of people, I think that's starting to drive a change in this industry, which is saying, we need to focus on automation. We need to actually look at this for the first time because we've got a risk to our business. And I think that hopefully will drive people to get over the hump because, as we found, it's difficult to start to innovate. But when you're there, it becomes a virtuous circle, as per the last slide. Anyway, let's get into a bit more the meat of this. So we found some interesting research related to complexity, right, Anne-Marie?
Yes, that's exactly right. And, when we started out talking about what would this research look like and what questions do we want to answer, we actually started out with complexity. So we were talking to John and team about, what does the typical IT SAP landscape look like? And, our guess was that it ranged depending on the different factors within each company, but that in general that there would be a percentage of folks that had high levels of complexity at the top. And actually what we ended up finding out is 53% of the folks that responded to the survey said it was either extremely or very complex. So our theory there was correct, that those systems, again, you think about how much we rely on technology, most people are adding systems, adding, things to their ERP system over time to get more value. And so it's probably not going to shrink over time. It looks like that it's going to continue to grow. And so if you take those trends that John was mentioning earlier about the idea of, needing people to run these systems and, people essentially equals cost at the end of the day, right? Because you're having to pay salaries or you're having to pay to outsource. Basically, when we asked about pain points related to maintaining these systems, we heard that the majority of said that the biggest pain point that they had was lack of resources. So I think 59% said that was what they were facing, shortly followed by the number 2 pain point, which was high cost at 45%. So obviously, as John mentioned, what we're doing today in the IT ops world for managing these SAP systems is not working for where we are today with the level of complexity. And if you project that out in 1, 2, 3 years where the systems are growing at an increasing level of complexity, we're going to be in even more trouble as we go down the road.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this week, and if we wind back 30 years, and it's amazing in SAP, we need to think in decades, not in years when we think about the market. What happened was people had piles of mainframes, Excel spreadsheets, Oracle databases all over their enterprise, thousands of them that ran the business in this sort of decentralized, complicated, extremely manual and expensive way. So we then said, right, we're going to implement in an ERP, we're going to implement R3 and later ERP Business Suite and S4. But the principle was the same back then, which was we're going to consolidate thousands of systems into one business process run across all of our companies in 160 end markets around the world. So that drove tremendous complexity down into relatively little complexity at that time. But the trouble then is, as one business consultant friend of mine said, business complexity drives IT complexity. Now I go and make an acquisition, and it's a little bit more complicated. Now I go and create a new market, and it gets more complicated. And you get this slow drive towards complexity. And now, this is now exacerbated because we have public clouds like SuccessFactors or Workday, and now we have hybrid clouds, and we have integrations. And this is kind of driving up to the costs, but I think I'm starting to spill over into your next piece of research, right, Anne-Marie? So
Exactly. One thing I'll add to what you're saying, John, is that right now there's so much emphasis and thought amongst ASUG members and member companies and organizations about moving to S/4HANA, right? That everyone's looking to move to that next step, refresh their ERP system, and rethink that. And there's a lot of rebuilding that has to happen now as a result of that. So that's really an opportunity, I think, to rethink some of these systems and processes that you've had in place maybe for the past 5 or 10 years and re-engineer them so that they do set you up in a place for innovation. And that's what SAP loves to say about, that's why you should move to S4, and that's the business case, is that you'll be able to scale up your innovation after that. That's only part of the puzzle, obviously, right? Because if your internal structure of your teams aren't set up to support that as well, you can put all of your time into building out and rolling out a new SAP S4HANA migration. But what happens afterward, right? How do you then continue to manage that system over time and sustain it over time and set it up so that it can pick up that kind of exponential growth over time that it should, right? You should be able to do that. And I think the other trend that is really critical here is, that's sped up by what's happening with COVID-19 at this point, is the move to digitization. So everything is becoming digital. So as you were describing, the past wave to ERP, it was about making business processes part of your ERP system and tracking all that data and, managing the data. Now it's saying, every little process we all used to do as a business that may have been a paper process or an Excel spreadsheet now has to be digital. It has to be managed through digital workflows. Well, again, all those connect up to the ERP if they're working correctly and they're all sharing that data. And so again, that speaks to that sort of internal complexity of what's going on at the organization. So this is the number that I've shared earlier that, where we asked folks to tell us what did their landscape look like, and 42% say very complex, 11% say extremely complex. So that's where that 50% number, so more than half, are essentially on the high end of the scale in terms of that complexity. And then when you think about those different trends in technology, it makes a lot of sense that that's what customers are facing today.
Yeah, and I'd probably add a couple of things there. So first, the SAP rhetoric that you dramatically simplify with S4 is true in isolation, but it's in conflict with business strategy, which is, acquisitions, new product lines, new markets. And so what could happen, and we see in some organizations that implement a central S4 system, is that their complexity jumps from here down, because they simplified a whole bunch of systems or digitized or whatever else. But in the meantime, it's sort of constantly creeping back up again. And so whilst at an individual customer level, you may say, hey, I don't agree with this because we're simplifying. Everyone else is sprawling slowly. And that's not through fault of anybody. As I said, that is business strategy driving IT complexity. I think actually, I can't remember the second thing I was going to say, so we can continue on down. Anyway, we'll move on. But I guess my question now is well, it's not so much a question as a comment. We asked what drives this complexity, and the trouble is it's complex and doubly complex, right? Because of the number of drivers of complexity.
Right, exactly. This was a question that we asked, and when we asked questions like this, we allow customers to essentially check all that apply, right? And that's why we end up with this type of data that comes out of it. And as you said, it's very clustered around certain numbers. I think what we see at the top is that number of systems that you're dealing with, number of SAP and non-SAP integrated systems at the top of that 59% as being the largest source of challenges. But when you look at these and you start to break them down, you can look at them in different categories. So there's a number of categories that are specific to the organization. And again, when we were kicking out this survey process with John and the Avantra team, we had a lot of theories about what this was actually going to be. And this isn't too far from what we had kicked around as our ideas, but it's definitely helps understand and get your arms around what you should look for within your own organization in terms of understanding the complexity of your system. So as I mentioned, that SAP, non-SAP integration is number one. You also have a lot of internal kind of factors that are specific to your company. So the number of locations that you have within the organization, your global presence, how big your organization is, how many years it's been in business, how much legacy tech do you have to deal with, and then in the middle there at 41%, sort of interesting that industry pops up. And I think this is something that we could probably have an entire webcast about separately from this one, but there are so many customizations that have to happen per industry within these systems that that if you're in a highly regulated business or something that involves a lot of tracking and controlling, then that's going to add complexity to your system as well. And then you have these sort of external factors like regulatory compliance, for example. And interestingly enough, that actually kind of ended up at the long tail here, not necessarily at the top. It's mostly essentially your identity and your corporate strategy as a company that tends to add to this, but we should not ignore that top number of 59%. Integration comes up in all the other research that we do. For example, the ASUG Pulse of the SAP customer, number one pain point that we hear from our customers about anything that they're doing to manage their SAP systems is integrations. It's making, because there's such a move to a best of breed approach, and nobody is ever living in a world where there is single vendor, except for in fantasy world. And so, IT teams have to hook up all these disparate systems and hope that they're going to work and hope that they stay connected and unbroken every time that there's an upgrade or a change, right? So that was, I think, a really good finding here, but also in some ways not surprising.
No, I think there's one thing that this slide doesn't show, which is the breakdown of the people that responded to this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that approximately half of the respondents were smaller businesses, and approximately half of them were very large businesses. And if you put that in this context, it's even more shocking, because smaller businesses very often only have one SAP system. So a bunch of these things just don't apply to them. And that means that you've got a lot of especially the large organizations in this world that run SAP, the big Fortune 100s, they've got the number of systems and the number of locations and the global presence and the organization size and their industry. All of these things are compounding that complexity, which I think it gives me a bit of a headache, to be honest.
That's very true. And yeah, I think we did have kind of our sweet spot for the respondents in this survey, and it's good that you brought that up, was the greater than 5 billion annual revenue. So about 36% sat there, so more than a third. And then after that, it was 1.5 billion to 5 billion. So we did get people that were a little bit on the larger end of the scale, but then we also had people that were in a 500 million to less than 1.5 billion in terms of revenue, which according to SAP is their mid-market or smaller market, right? So you do bring up a good point that the size of your organization, even though, there are all these different factors, and it does show up in the middle as, 44% organization size does contribute to complexity. It's just because you're small doesn't mean you're not complex, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that surprised me is that customers don't see the implementation partners and the SIs as being complicit in this, not in an outweighted way, at least. Which is, as someone that's worked in the services industry, I always felt that complexity is part of what makes SAP what it is. Somebody told me of a quote from someone that said, we made R3 complicated so you couldn't take it out. Right.
There's the whole switching cost factor, right? Is that, something like this is so requires so much resource intensive investment to put in that you're loath to take it out if something goes wrong with it, right? And I'm sure your CFO would not write that check. There's no doubt about that.
For many organizations, it's too much risk to the organization to do so.
Right.
It's not worth it. Right. Particularly because, as we've seen elsewhere, a lot of the time you don't want to innovate in the core. You want the core to run itself.
Correct. You have to build that innovation up around it. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the things we found. Anyway, moving on to automation, and I guess if I look back to when I started to work with Avantra, I want to say it was actually, I was talking with Jeff Scott from ASUG, I think it was Sapphire of last year, so it was May of 2019, and it just sort of suddenly occurred to me, why do we need hundreds of thousands of people at least whose job is to get up in the morning and run a daily check on a system, for example. So they get a Word document and they go and they log into each system in turn and they make notes. This is an industry. And then they go and check, they log into the SAP website and they go and check for what's called hot news, which is, what happened that's urgent. Did a very high severity security alert come out? If it did, what systems does that apply to? If it does apply to these 100 systems, what is my action plan for that? Or did I even notice it? Did I miss it? And then I've got to apply it to 100 systems. I've got to go out and I've got to create a change request. So I go into Remedy or ServiceNow and I start creating change requests. We go out to the business owners, we get approvals. Now I have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to the maintenance window. Now I shut this system down. I run a simple update. I bring it back down. Now I wake up the functional person so he can test it. And why do we have hundreds of thousands of people doing this when we've also got a dearth of people available to do the extremely important move to S4? It doesn't make any sense in 2020. And if you look at other organizations like SuccessFactors or Workday or Salesforce or Google, Amazon, Microsoft, the hyperscalers, these people don't exist. And Google call it SRE, site reliability engineering. And their job is to program the systems so they do this stuff themselves. And that kind of that's really self-evident when you think in cloud native. And it does not at all exist in the SAP world. And I just, Jeff and I were talking about it, it didn't make any sense to us. And so what we then started to think about was, how do we take the things that people do on a day-to-day basis, and we take that, that kernel upgrade example I just said, where we identify that a security problem happened. We then identify what systems it apply to. We automatically go out to a workflow and we automatically patch a system. Why can't that be automated? And then we come back to that slide at the beginning, the vicious versus the virtuous circle. We can now reallocate that budget, the people, the capacity for organizational change, because people have to do these approvals. We reallocate that into innovation. It's probably a good time for me to hand over to you, Anne-Marie, because this is what we started to find in the research, right? Which was we started to find that there was a virtual circle. But perhaps before we get to that, we should go through this linearly and get back to the research and projects. So we asked about SAP projects, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And this, again, points to the same kind of challenges that I mentioned earlier, that lack of resources, the high costs. And there's a couple of other interesting ones here that are worth mentioning. 35% said that another challenge was a lack of consistency in managing, configuring, and onboarding IT systems across the landscape, right? So that speaks to the integration point that I made a bit earlier, that it's just hard to keep everything connected and configured the way it needs to be. And then an interesting one popped up here too, the 32% human error, right? So John, I'm guessing that person who it's their job to wake up at 3 a.m. and start to test these changes probably doesn't have that great a job satisfaction. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're a night owl and they like to do that. But I think that the way that process works does, when you describe it in a vacuum, does sound a bit crazy. And I think this does come up in other research that we've done before too, where, getting back to the point of the complexity and the sprawling nature of these systems and all the integration points, it's really hard to know where the problems are, right? And even if you are troubleshooting, even if you are, responding to an SAP note about fixing something, SAP is going to tell you about their own systems. They're not necessarily going to tell you about how that interacts with your third-party add-ons or anything like that. So that could create a waterfall effect of, other problems and challenges throughout your whole systems that you don't know about, and what you don't know, you don't know. So I think, when you're relying on humans to figure that out, and it's just the scale of your system is so broad that it's, unless you have really, really great gut instinct, which some people do, it's really hard to know whether there's a problem there that you don't know about, again. And I think the other thing that's interesting here too, that we're going to get into a little bit, is that we did find some very interesting correlations among customers that do have automation strategies. We asked a question about, do you have, certain strategies in place for your technology? One of which was, do you have a digital transformation strategy in place? Do you have a cloud strategy in place? And thirdly, do you have an automation strategy in place? And we did some data cuts here to look at things like these challenges to see what would happen if we looked at the population who said yes to those things. Yes, I have an automation strategy versus no, I don't, to see if there were any changes. And we did find some interesting correlations there.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to your point on human error, I got sort of one little story and an observation. I spoke to a prospect last year about this, and I said, what's your number one concern when it comes to IT operations? And he said, I hate it that my guys have to get up at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning to do the maintenance window work. It's like, it's not right. It's not fair to their families. It's not a good use of their time. I hate that. And now you take into account on the drivers for human error. For a start, typically the people that do this work are the least experienced. So you don't get your most experienced people to do the day-to-day work. That's just how it works. You cut your teeth on these small updates. And then in addition to that, there's the number of places in which it can go wrong. Did you identify what needed to be done? Did you identify which systems you need to apply that to? Did you get the instructions right? Did you download the right file? Did you get all of the right files? If in these simple updates, you typically have to update 5 or 6 different things and put them together. And then did you follow the instructions? And you just take the number of different places in which that can go wrong. And that is just not what humans are good at, because we're great at creative things. We are not good at repeating the same thing over and over again. So maybe we'll move now on to what we found in this research in terms of how organizations are innovating today in IT operations.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, just to bring up those numbers from earlier, we did ask those organizations to tell us who has strategies in place for these different things. And 82% told us that they have a cloud strategy, which I'll tell you, John, when it comes to different populations that we survey, that is quite high. There are a lot of other populations within the SAP customer community that don't have cloud strategies at all. So 82% was very high. 79% said that they had a digital transformation strategy in place, and 65% said they had an automation strategy in place. Now, 65% is fairly high. Still is an opportunity there. 65% is not 100%. So something to kind of keep in mind for those who don't have that automation strategy in place yet. But, we did also ask them to tell us, how do they innovate? Right? When you're thinking about specifically IT operations, specifically for SAP, what are the tools that they use to to innovate? And automation came up as number one. And new tools was number 2. So looking for, new monitoring and reporting tools that help them do their jobs better, to help them, at least bring some sanity to the 3 a.m. checks. Number 3 was the cloud, and number 4 was S4HANA. So I think that the IT ops organizations definitely see themselves as right smack in the center of making sure that they're delivering S4HANA to the organization, and that's an important tool for them to make sure that they have this the best, most advanced ERP at the core.
Now remind me here, because it might be important, but did we get the results for this pre or post COVID? or at what stage? I forget.
I think we were somewhat in the middle of COVID actually when we did this. I believe it. We had the analysis put together kind of around September timeframe, so we would have probably closed the survey. I'm going to guess somewhere around the end of July, early August. So I think we're well, let's say we're well into it, but I will sort of throw the caveat out there that, I don't know if anyone saw the earnings results for Q3 for SAP. There's going to be kind of a slow wave of changes to IT spending, IT investments, what people are thinking about for their IT strategies and budgets and plans that we won't see happen immediately after COVID. I think we'll see it kind of start to slowly roll in over quarter by quarter into 21. So, but yeah, we did, COVID was in place and at this point, and we did ask a specific question about, how is COVID affecting your strategies overall? And off the top of my head, the results that we got were very consistent with what we get when we ask that of the entire ASUG membership population, which is that for some people, it actually is accelerating their work. You think about the folks who are having to digitally transform very quickly because they're in a more of a brick and mortar type of world, and they have to make sure that they have the people that they're working with, up to speed. Maybe they're transitioning to, e-commerce or something like that, where they're used to doing more in-person sales or things like that. So the numbers broke down like this: 38% said that they made no change to their digital transformation plans. 24% said that they've actually prioritized or accelerated those transformation plans. And then 19% said what they're doing is they're actually just figuring out the whole remote work component and how that fits in with digital transformation plans, which again, we've heard, folks who have S/4HANA transitions in play are having to figure out how to finish them or complete them remote, which is something that maybe a lot of people didn't anticipate when they were putting together those project plans to begin with. And then only 17% said that they were postponing or delaying those plans due to lack of funds or resources. So, 17% is a significant enough number, but it's not like we're seeing a wholesale jump to everybody hitting the brakes as far as innovation or investment goes.
Yeah. I was just reflecting that perhaps if we'd have done this survey a year ago, S/4HANA would have been higher up the list. I wonder whether
that could very much be true. Yes. Because again, your point of resources. So all of the points that we've been talking about, where the pressures are coming in with lack of resources, lack of money, that will amplify automation, right? Because automation is a tool to help you save money and to do more with less, essentially.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that shift, especially from a services perspective. The services business, they want to automate because they think it creates a differentiation to them in the market, and there is an imperative to do so. And by the way, I think my conversations in the market really mirror what you just said, which is most organizations are investing in technology, but they're investing in it for a very specific business outcome. So they're very careful on what they spend money on, that it increases their market or it digitizes where they have an imperative to do so. I saw an example today where the UK property ombudsman has a COVID outbreak, and they don't have any remote work capability. They don't have laptops. So this is an organization that now suddenly has to digitize. And so what are they spending their money on? Well, they're spending it on laptops and VPNs and whatever, just to get back to work, perhaps some systems so that they can process things electronically. That's a real imperative. And perhaps, updating a finance system isn't at the top of the list, but something around customer experience probably gets prioritized. I wonder whether the research that I'm seeing suggests that the spend isn't changing. It's just being moved around. We'll see what that means for SAP later in the year, but it definitely dinged them this quarter.
It varies a lot by industry. Yeah. It varies a lot by industry, obviously, John. And certain industries are treading water. Some are doing quite well, and others are in dire straits, right? So I think that the industry factor is there too.
Wow, there's so much in these slides that we probably need to speed up a little bit. So within identified then a link between innovation and automation, right?
We did, yeah. And so as I was previewing a bit earlier, that we found an interesting correlation between those customers that had those three different strategies in place, the digital transformation strategy, the cloud strategy, and automation. We, of course, dialed into the automation strategy in particular to see what that does for these business challenges that we know that the IT ops teams are facing. And we did find that those numbers dropped significantly for those who had an automation strategy in place. So if you see the little blue check mark bottom right, that number reflects the folks that do have the automation strategy. The orange X shows the people who do not. So the most important and the strongest numbers came back in for costs. So there's essentially a 33% difference in terms of those who are suffering from high costs who do not have that automation strategy in place versus those that do. So that's probably the most stark one. And then you can also look at lack of resources, a 10% difference there. Those without the strategy in place are saying that that's a bigger challenge for those who do. And then again, that consistency point that we had talked about earlier, the consistency for managing upgrades and connections and integrations. There's a smaller differential, but there's still 7% difference between those who are experiencing those challenges as without an automation strategy in place versus those who do. So I think this was sort of, to me, the biggest aha moment of the whole study, that when you do have these strategies in place, it does help you accomplish those goals. And we asked a question earlier on about how when you think of what transformation is or innovation is, what is it? And honestly, the reasons why people do those projects are to do this. They're to save money, they're to provide efficiency, and they're to provide innovation and increase the success of the business. So all of that really kind of aligned more than I think I would have expected it to when we started the process of this study.
Yeah, and I was talking to a friend this week who is implementing AIOps strategies in a very large business. It's actually not a business that runs SAP, but he said that they were with AI and ML techniques and automation, they were delivering a 30 to 50% reduction in cost in those IT systems where they had applied those strategies, and that mirrors the cost thing that you're talking about here. And what, of course, then happens is these individuals and the budget that were spent on maintaining the systems get reinvested back into the innovation strategy, right? So you get this virtuous circle which accelerates the more you invest in automation, which I find fascinating.
That's exactly right. And the other thing we learned too is that there are. When we look at the innovators, so we asked a question about how much time do you spend innovating versus executing, and we were able to do a data cut on that too, so we could look at what was different for the innovators versus the executors. And we did find that more innovators use automation. So there was 11% differential between the executors. Interestingly enough, too, they also focus more on customer experience. Right. So if you think about, what automation can allow you to do, it does open up time for you to focus on those more important customer facing projects.
Right, exactly. So, I'm going to cover this very briefly because I feel like we've gone over a lot of what I was going to say here, but my instructions on this slide were to make the case for automation. I feel like the research has done that to itself. And what we found was the more you invest in automating the business as usual, the more money, more organizational energy you have, the more agility you have to make changes. All of these things compound, and it almost feels like there are two types of organizations, right? There are those that are automating and innovating, and those that are not yet automating and innovating. And you're almost in one bucket or the other, and perhaps being a little bit more extreme than the research suggests. But I think it's a really neat way of looking at it. I will continue on through here. We also asked about what AIOps is, right? And I talked to Gartner about this, and they said, one of the difficulties with AIOps is it's not like you can have a magic quadrant, because it means multiple different things to multiple different people. And if you take the things that are in the market market of AI ops, like Avantra, like Splunk. You can't compare Avantra and Splunk. They do completely different things. So we got a little bit of that out in the research that we did, right?
That's right, and I think that you can see that there's a fair amount of consistency. If you look at the numbers, they're pretty evenly spread of the different definitions. But the number one that kind of squeaked into the top was leveraging AI to manage IT operations, or DevOps in particular, which is pretty much the sweet spot of Avantra, correct?
Yeah. Yep. That's what we do.
Right. But I think the point is here that there's some education needed, and even though that we found in the research that our customers, as ASUG members, are interested in it, that they want to learn more, they're not to the point where they're ready per se, because they need to learn more about what it is and what it can do for their organizations first.
Yeah, exactly. And Avantra does these in a very SAP centric perspective, right? And that's the difference between the different types of AI ops companies. If you take, Splunk is reading in log files from thousands of systems to try to find anomalies, whereas we're much more narrowly focused on, what are the things that an SAP operations team does every day? How do we automate those so that you can spend time doing much more important things like for example, S4 or innovation or whatever else you need to be doing. So that's our lens on it, and that's how we see it. And then we also found, I do want to make some time for some questions, but we've got 3 slides and get to it. We found a link between AI ops and automation, right?
Yes, exactly. So I think that this shows a little bit, as I was mentioning, we found that when you look at the innovators and what innovators are doing, innovators are using more automation. So in this question, we asked who's currently using and who's planning to use, and the folks at the bottom and the folks who are not using or planning to use any of these technologies. But the cloud came up as the top in automation number 2. But one of the things that allows you to do is, if you use that automation properly, you can do things like predictive analytics more. You can do more AI projects or machine learning projects throughout organizations. So there's that runway of where people are hoping to do that in the future. But I think that, currently using number is key, because, you need to be able to get the lower value work off your plate, so to speak, so that you can do those bigger projects that frankly, SAP customers tell us all the time that they wish they had and wish they were able to do.
Yeah, I think the thing this slide doesn't bring out is the breadth of what automation could be, right? Because it's you start, and maybe we should have asked a question on this, but we didn't, because you can start automating by, I don't know, you start with your daily checks. By the way, that was the first thing that Avantra did 20 years ago. We did daily check automation, where this is these things you log into the system. And that would be, that would be one thing. But, the sorts of scenarios that we're looking at, we're delivering in our November release, with fully automated kernel patching across 1,000 systems, identifying which can be applied to which, automated with rollbacks, documentation, blah, blah, blah. And so the fact that people are using automation doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it in a very sophisticated way. And that's where you see that they're using automation, but not predictive analytics or AI and machine learning. So I think that what this is also saying is that those that are using automation are planning to get much more sophisticated in their use of it.
Correct. Yes, that's very true. And you're right to paint the picture that automation means a lot of different things to a lot of different companies. But, that's where that automation strategy is so important, because if you have that for your organization, you know what you're investing in terms of automation and where it's important versus where you've decided not to pursue at this point in time.
Yep, makes sense. Next thing we asked was about what respondents wanted to see in an SAP-specific AIOps package. What did we find there?
Yeah, I mean, the top number, again, these are fairly tightly clustered, so I would argue that these are all important, right, according to what the customers told us. So monitoring and analytics comes in as number 1, upgrades and patching number 2, and performance management is number 3. So, this again, knowing that the majority of respondents in this particular study are not currently using AIOps, this is their wish list.
Right. Yeah. Understood. And interestingly, from my perspective, we don't have time to get into it in today's call, but I think about quite a lot more when I think about SAP Aiops. I'm thinking broader, but I think part of the issue is this crawl, walk, run perspective that people are taking. Well, great. So we got through our content in time to take a couple of questions. Did we miss anything? Did you have anything to wrap to before we get to Q&A?
No, I think that the one thing that I would add, John, is this. We're talking about the megatrends that are basically coming out of this research, and I think if I were to sum up what I see them, number of organizations, particularly those responsible for SAP systems, they really have that desire and the business need to innovate. It's just that there are some barriers in the way, cost, resources, et cetera. We've talked about them multiple times to getting them there. I think the second trend that we saw in here is that automation is really helping those teams do more with less. And I think that will continue to increase as budgets get tightened with respect to COVID-19 and just general challenges in business. And then I think the last point, I think, is, you saw that there was a high use of cloud strategy and cloud in this cohort here. We didn't get into that too much here, but I think that cloud is another layer of complexity that we've heard about. And, the majority of customers we talk to are definitely using a hybrid situation. So they have their on-prem systems, they have their cloud systems, and they're trying to make them all talk and interconnect. So that's another trend that we're seeing, that, again, automation and making sure that you're using your IT staff appropriately to manage those complexities is really important.
Yeah, and I sort of want to close probably with a couple of things, which is, first of all, we see interest in Aiops and automation just increasing this year. Is it because of COVID? Is it just the time? I don't know, but I think everyone is talking about this when they weren't talking about it a year ago. I think the other thing that I take from my perspective is I understand that SAP wants its customers to be running on the latest and greatest. There are lots of reasons why that's good for them and probably good for customers in many cases. But we take a completely judgment-free approach to it. So we have customers running R3 version 4.6c. We've got customers running on HP Unix. We've got customers running in the hybrid cloud, the Google cloud. They're running SuccessFactors and Ariba or Coupa. We don't judge if a customer wants to run Coupa, or if they want to run Ariba, or if they want to run SuccessFactors, or if they want to run Workday. It's not, as an IT operations company, it's not our job to judge. We just have to embrace what it is that people are doing. That's our job. But maybe on some questions, I'm going to give you a real softball to start with. Are we going to share the data? I think we've got something coming at the beginning of next year, probably now.
Yes. So there was also a question in here, John, that I can answer. So somebody asked me to restate those revenue bands of the respondents here, and I'll talk through that. So starting at the top, the greater than 5 billion annual revenue, that was 36% of the respondents. So that was our highest percentage of respondents. Down from there, 1.5 billion to 5 billion, that was at 29%. Then 500 million to less than 1.5 million was 13%. We had 19% in the very small business, so less than $500 million annual revenue. And then we had the balance of the percentage went to governments and nonprofits. So that was the revenue breakout that we were. So hopefully that clarifies that question for you.
Yep. Yeah. And maybe you can speak briefly. We've got a white paper coming with more detail of data, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's coming out probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, is it that quick? I thought it was early next year.
Well, it depends on how quickly you distribute it, but we'll be done on our end in the next 3 to 4 weeks, I think.
Oh, great.
So there's a question in here. John, that I think you can answer about DevOps. So with organizations changing more for DevOps models and product organizations, how is your experience with the complexity in applying controls and processes while trying to establish a more development and operation model and ways of working?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take an IT ops perspective on this, I just think, ServiceNow is at the core of all of this. So it's not, we do this in SAP context, but you need to automate the workflows to define all of this stuff. Otherwise, there's no solution to controls and processes. And so the approach that we take at Avantra is we say, right, what it is that we want to achieve, and working with the customer now. Just a simple example, they have maintenance window. What we do, maintenance window automation. So in ServiceNow, you determine what the maintenance window will be, when it will be. In Avantra, you determine what it is you're going to do. And then that becomes an automated thing that happens at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday. But it also goes out to the relevant approvals, so you have the controls for processes when that happens. And I think that's the critical piece, because you have an audit log, you have a log of what happened. Everything is lined up. But for me, that's where Avantra and ServiceNow really solve that problem together.
Got it. Moving on, I wanted to ask a question. So one of the participants asked a question about the cloud-based apps. So all the increasing numbers of cloud-based apps requiring integration. Could you say a little bit about how Avantra helps SAP customers manage that hybrid situation they're very much in, with the integrations between the cloud apps and the on-prem apps?
Yeah, absolutely. And just because we take a no judgment approach, it's good and bad, but it means that we have to support everything. And, I think there's 30,000 SAP SKUs. I'm sure we don't support all of them, but we support a lot of them. Like I said, from R346C to we're introducing Sybase IQ support now. Why? Because a lot of big SAP customers have got Sybase IQ. But now coming back to the cloud point, we also have what we call a cloud service connector. And this requires ideally the cloud app to be monitoring aware, but a lot of them are. So SAP Cloud Platform integration, for example, is aware. The Cloud Platform Neo is aware, and we can get the metrics of that and of the interfaces that happen out of those. And so now you think, if you take the Ariba scenario where you've got procurement that's integrated into a core finance system, you want to be able to see how is that working end to end. And so we connect out to Ariba into the monitoring frameworks that they've got, and we connect, of course, into the relevant S4 system, and that becomes one view on the enterprise. And that's just the way all businesses are moving if they're not already.
So I think we have time for one more question. We've just got a couple minutes left. One of our participants today said, thanks for the session. It's a burning topic. Can you tell me, have you already identified the tasks to automate apart from monitoring and daily tasks? Are there any plans for kernel upgrades, conversions of the SAP system, or OS database migration?
Yeah, and here's the approach that we take to that. So we go to our customer base, and we sit with them when we look to identify what are the people doing on a day-to-day basis, and what are the ones that are taking time. And I'll give you an example of something that we didn't choose: an installation of SAP. Why? Because you do it once and then it's done. And so we look for the things that are done in a repetitive way to prioritize. And by the way, you can do the installation of SAP automated if you want to. It's not difficult, but we just haven't prioritized it. What have we prioritized? Well, for our November the release, the big one is the kernel upgrade. So that's fully automated. And you select what you want to apply, it identifies what systems you can apply it to, you schedule it to happen during a maintenance window, or you put it in a ServiceNow window. You can schedule it from there, whatever works, and it runs end to end. It checks the files, it checks the transfer, it tests, it takes the systems down when you want it to. It patches the system, brings it back up, and it tests it. And if there's a problem, by the way, it rolls back and it keeps the backup for 30 days. They've thought about it end to end. For our product roadmap, what's coming next, we're still making the final decisions on that, because we do go into product planning a little bit later on. But the things that we're thinking about are the HANA update. That's going to be a quick win. And the next big one is the support package stacks, which are a pretty frequent thing that has to happen across systems. And we believe they're reasonably easily, mostly automated. Probably won't be 100% automation because of the need to check for custom code remediation in some instances. So there'll be a manual step probably in that. Those are the things that we're thinking about, but we're also meeting with current customers and prospects to make sure, and we just say, what are the things that are spending the time? Break down what's spent on the time. We have customers and they give us lists, percentage of time spent on items. It's kind of exciting.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to do this research with you, John, and the whole Avantra team. And I hope that it's helpful to all of the customers that joined us today as they're going through their own automation journey.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much for taking the time as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. I thought we were going to have time to spare. I can't believe we burnt through every minute. So there we go.
There's plenty to talk about with this study, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you both so much for presenting today. Before everyone takes off, just a quick reminder that we will bring out this presentation recording on demand tomorrow, and there will be a link to that survey that's going to pop up after this webcast concludes. Out to let us and our speakers know how we did. And also, if you refresh your page, you should see in the resources the annual pulse of the SAP customer study. Valued ASUG member and SAP customer, we would love to hear your perspective on what you are experiencing now and planning for 2021. And if you are there's a quick 10-minute survey that's in there, and if you are one of the first 500 participants who qualify and complete the survey in one sitting, you will receive a $20 Amazon gift card. The survey closes on Friday, so don't miss your chance. And otherwise, that is about it since we are out of time. But thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.